My involvement in politics or local body politics led me to central government. And I think it's really quite important if you're going to be in politics to ask yourself a very simple question, and that is why I'm in politics. And if you're only there, for your own ego, but the truth is, if you're there and you want to do something worthwhile, then you have to be prepared, uh, to put yourself in some cases at risk. And I've always had a philosophy that at the end of the day, you can't win unless you're prepared to lose. And I think it was Thomas Sowell who said, if you want to help people, you tell them the truth. If you want to help yourself, then you tell them what they want to hear. And the truth is, far too many politicians are all about telling people what they want to hear. They do polling, they tell them what they want to hear rather than telling them the truth of the situation a country faces.
As New Zealand's former finance minister from 1984 to 1988, Sir Roger Douglas earned global acclaim for orchestrating pivotal economic reforms for the country. Following his entry into Parliament in 1969, he became a cabinet minister in 1973 during the tenure of the third Labour government. Here, he handled the portfolios of broadcasting, post office, and later housing. Transitioning to the fourth Labour government, he assumed the role of finance minister in 1984, leading comprehensive changes including deregulation, currency floating, state trading corporatization, and privatization. Sir Roger was acknowledged with prestigious awards, including the Euromoney Magazine Award in 1985, Frederick von Hayek Medal in 2002, and the Turgid Freedom Prize in 2008. Post-Parliament, he managed Roger Douglas Associates, held directorships, and co-founded ACT-NZ. His international work spans the globe over, including countries such as the USA, Russia, China, and India, contributing to their economic restructuring. A few of his notable publications include Toward Prosperity, Completing the Circle, and No Second-Class Citizens. He joins us here in our latest episode of Advocata Conversations.
Welcome, Sir Roger. From Sri Lanka, all the way from Sri Lanka. Good day to you. How are things with you?
Not too bad. When you're 86, things don't always go smoothly. I managed somehow to fall over the other day, and that was quite what I was hoping for, but there you are.
Welcome to today's Advocata Conversation. You have a tremendous track record as being one of the greatest structural reformers in the world, and I think your story is very interesting. If I may start with, could I know a little bit about your personal story?
Well, I've been in politics, if you like, all my life. I come from a political family. My grandfather was a member of the New Zealand Parliament for, I think, 25 years. My father was also a member of Parliament for 15 years and a trade unionist and president of the Labor Party for a period of time. So, my background was politics. In those circumstances, you either like it, love it, or hate it. And my background is an accountant. I got involved at a local body level in politics, and in a sense, at the end of the day, I had to make a decision: will I stay in the commercial world, or will I move into the political field?
Mhm. So, you did a lot of important structural reform, economic reform. Now, by training, if you were an accountant, how did you get so engrossed in economic reform?
Well, as an accountant, you are interested in what's going on, but my involvement in politics or local body politics led me to central government. And I think it's really quite important if you're going to be in politics to ask yourself a very simple question, and that is why I'm in politics. And if you're only there, for your own ego, but the truth is, if you're there and you want to do something worthwhile, then you have to be prepared, uh, to put yourself in some cases at risk. And I've always had a philosophy that at the end of the day, you can't win unless you're prepared to lose. And I think it was Thomas Sowell who said, if you want to help people, you tell them the truth. If you want to help yourself, then you tell them what they want to hear. And the truth is, far too many politicians are all about telling people what they want to hear. They do polling, they tell them what they want to hear rather than telling them the truth of the situation a country faces.
It's interesting that you mentioned Thomas Sowell, because for us in Advocata, his book Basic Economics is quite literally a Bible here. Presume you have read the book
Well, so
also.
should we? He's, you know, I quote him quite a bit. I met him once. He came to New Zealand and spent a couple of weeks, 2 or 3 weeks here with him. And he's an amazing person. He has the gift of making really complex things um, quite simple.
Yes, we tend to agree with that. Um, so, can you please explain for the benefit of our audience? You said that your whole family was with the Labour Party. Why? What was it exactly that the New Zealand Labour Party stood for? What is their political ideology?
Well, the Labor Party uh, really was born out of the trade union movement, and early on, you'd say it was a socialist party, but there was really at the heart of it the people who founded it and were its leaders in the early years. Their main aim really was to have for their children and and the people they represented the same things that the more affluent did. For example, in 1972, which was 3 years after I'd been in Parliament 3 years, um, I introduced into Parliament a private member's bill for superannuation for everyone. Now, the concept there was when I'd worked at Bremworth Carpet, I'd had a superannuation scheme. I became a member of Parliament, I had a superannuation scheme. And the simple question was, why can't everyone who works have a superannuation scheme if they want one?
For the benefit of my audience, superannuation, is it a contributory pension system?
In New Zealand, my my scheme was, which I introduced in 1972. But our current scheme is not. It's a pay-as-you-go scheme, and for the retired, it's quite generous, and frankly, it's going to cause New Zealand real trouble in the future. It might be 20 years off, 15 to 20 years, but unless it changes, we're in great difficulty. I'm a very strong advocate of from moving away from the pay as you go and having a savings scheme. And in other words, savings, not taxation. We tax and then the government hands out the pensions. And it's just going to get too costly because really in retirement, it's not just pensions, it's healthcare as well.
And the whole population is eligible for the superannuation?
Yes, once you're 65, then you automatically get the superannuation. Yes, there, there are certain rules, but it is getting more and more expensive. The estimates are that super for the retired and healthcare for the retired is going to increase by over 6% of GDP by 2061. That's a huge amount. And quite frankly, send the country broke. There'll be a lot of taxpayers, so I'm just not going to contribute. And how will they not contribute? They'll come and live in Sri Lanka or Australia.
So, Sir Roger, you wrote a seminal piece for a paper that you delivered to the Mont Pelerin Society in 1989 called Politics of Successful Structural Reform. And in your introduction, you say the following, and I would like to read it out. Politicians tend to close their minds as long as they can see the need for structural reform because they believe that decisive action must inevitably bring political calamity upon the government. As their country's economy drifts closer to crisis and a structural problem are no longer deniable, they persuade themselves that action within a relatively short time of an election would give the advantage to their political opponents. They convince themselves that this stance is justified by pretending that the opponents are deceitful and interested only in their own gain, not the country's well being. When the economic situation is serious enough to arouse public concern, in many cases, both parties may seek to evade the issue by offering electoral bribes to distract voters from the real problem. When I read this, I was wondering whether you were talking about Sri Lanka. Perhaps to give some context, can you explain what was going on in New Zealand before you started your political career or the reform process?
Well, we started the reform process in 1984, and essentially uh, we were faced on winning government in August of 1984 with a real crisis. The banks were closed to foreign exchange dealing. So we came into office, I became Minister of Finance, and we had a real problem on our hands. We devalued by 20%. We lifted all the interest rate controls and some made major changes of that nature. And I think that we thought about this quite a lot, but the first point I make in that paper, I think, is that if you're going to be successful in terms of structural change, then you have to have quality change. There's absolutely no point in having compromise change, because if you do that, if you only sort of go halfway, what happens? It won't work, and it comes back to bite you. And if you do that, then and you want to do it later, it makes it a lot even more difficult than facing it right up front.
So, in your paper, you talk about 10 principles. And the first principle that you say is for quality policies, you need quality people. And you go on to say the following: the policy starts with people. It emerges from the quality of their observation, knowledge, analysis, imagination, ability to think laterally to develop a wide range of options. The success of our policies, sector reforms since 1984 depended on the people as much as policy. Replacing people who cannot or will not adapt to new environment is pivotally important. You also talk about the team that you had in the Labour Party that came into power. Can you elaborate a little bit about what the environment was during that period and how you attracted this talent into the party?
Well, I think, to be honest, I think the leader of the National Party, which is supposed to be the Conservative Party, he attracted a lot of people into the Labor Party for us. What I mean, his policies, he had interest rate controls, price controls, you name it, he tried to control it. And it obviously didn't work. It was never going to work. And and that brought into the Parliamentary Labor Party uh, some young, bright people who want to make change. And I think one of the things which wasn't actually, we didn't talk about, but and it helped us in terms of being successful in government, was that you had a feeling that you're going to do the right thing. Whatever, we were going to do the right thing. If it meant we lost the next election, so be it. The truth was, in the end of the day, despite all the major changes we made, we won the next election with a couple of extra seats. But the quality of the people in the parliamentary party, but more particularly than the quality of the people that we put into position in positions in, say, the health department, in the SOEs like electricity. And these were people, we didn't pick them for political reasons. I mean, politicians who appoint people who, frankly, because they're a mate or part of their party, who aren't up to it, are crazy. Because at the end of the day, if they appoint a mug, and that mug, frankly, does a bad job, the politician looks terrible. I might be a mug as a politician, but if I appoint someone who's great and he does a great job, oh, guess what? I look like a champion, whether I am or not. So it's important to appoint good people, and there are good people out there. And when you're talking about a country, when New Zealand was in trouble, a lot of our big business people took on roles in the government and they wanted to make a contribution. And we had quite a competitive position. The head of electricity, he was competing to show that he was more outstanding than the head of forestry, etc. And I'll just give you one turnaround in forestry. In the last year in the state, as a state run organisation, the expenditure exceeded the revenue in forestry by $180 million. 2 years later, we had Alan Gibbs, who was running it, and he gave Richard Prebble, who was the state-owned enterprise minister, and myself as Minister of Finance, a check for $132 million. So we went from $184 million, that's it, to a positive of 132 in 2 years. That's amazing, really.
So you mentioned about appointing quality people. So you also have, like the British tradition, an independent civil service, right, with permanent secretaries?
Yes, there was, particularly in Treasury. Treasury were the key driver to what happened within the civil service. But there were also appointments made from the State Services Commission, and there were some quality people there. We ensured that. And in the end of the day, it was interesting. A lot of the Treasury people went out and became heads of other departments.
Okay. So the private sector people that you attracted, they gave up their positions because of the crisis and they came into government?
Well, essentially, well, they didn't really come into government because where we appointed them was, say, we had state-owned enterprises, which were really businesses like electricity. So someone from the private sector came in and became the chairman of the board. So they had a board of directors. They came in and became the chairman of that. And generally, the first thing that they did was find a top class chief executive. And we had appointments from all around the world. For example, New Zealand Post, the new appointment as chief executive of New Zealand Post came from Australia. In the case of Telecom, the new chief executive came from the United Kingdom. A lot of New Zealanders came through a little later, but initially there were a number of appointments from overseas.
There was no nationalistic thinking saying that, we should not appoint foreigners and we should give these positions to locals?
Well, we set it up. In the end of the day, it wasn't our job. We appointed, say, Alan Gibbs as head of forestry. It was his job to appoint the chief executive. That was one case where he appointed the person who had lost 184 million. But that person in 2 years turned it around, same person, and gave us a check for 132. And I think I say in that paper, if you change the climate, sometimes you change the performance.
So, in order to attract this foreign talent, you would have had to pay above average wages, and that was okay by you all?
Yes, they determined the who was employed and how much the top people were. I mean, we were interested in the bottom line. I mean, I don't know how much we were paid at 184 million loss, and we got 132 million profit and a check after the chief executive had been paid. I wasn't too worried about how much they got paid, frankly.
Okay. Uh, the second principle that you talk about is implement reform in quantum leaps using large packages. And you go on to say, do not try to advance a step at a time. Define your objectives clearly and move towards them by quantum leaps. Otherwise, the interest groups will have time to mobilize and drag you down. Would you like to elaborate on that?
Well, instead of doing a sort of step-by-step process, we made major changes in terms of packages. So it wouldn't be fair, for example, to take away all the subsidies that the farmers have. The farmers' support before we came in was about 30% of their income. We took it away, a whole lot, gone. I think their support was down to less than 1%. That 1% was like the work the overseas trade and government did on behalf of farmers. Now, that's a big change. Now, if we'd only made that change to farmers wouldn't have been able to cope. But we got rid of import licensing. We lowered tariffs. We did a whole range of other things which enabled farmers to adjust because it lowered dramatically their cost structure. We improved the ports. The performance in the ports went up by 100%, so it lowered the cost of the farmer getting their goods to market. And at the end of the day, You might get a few farmers, but I don't think you get any farmers in New Zealand who want to go back to the position they were in 1984. So there was a trade-off, and that's important. I remember when I did my first budget, I met with the heads of all the uh, various business entities in New Zealand. And in the end of the day, the only people who complained was the truckies, who had faced an increase in their costs of around 48%. And now and everyone else actually, got stuck in because there was a trade-off. Now, sure, farmers lost their subsidies, but when we lowered tariffs, when we got rid of import licensing, they were able to buy their produce cheaper, etc., their inputs. And so whilst you lose when a privilege, and I call them privileges, is taken away from you, you actually had a vested interest in other groups losing their privileges. And of course, in the process, you got rid of the government out of it and you lowered costs generally.
In your paper, you also say the economy operates as an organic whole, not an unrelated collection of bits and pieces. Structural reform aims to improve the quality of interaction within the whole. I think you were alluding to this just now. Were there any other examples?
Well, the big example was dismantling privileges and allowing people to get on with the job themselves. And so the improvement in productivity was quite remarkable because they became business focused. Take the post office. One of the first things they decided was we want 95% of the mail to arrive the next day. And they did it. But at the same time, they lowered costs. I mean, there were sacrifices obviously made. I mean, let's take telecom. They went from a staff of 27,000 down to 7,000 or 8,000, and their output went up. And that improvement in productivity, which was what drove the economy and improved profitability and lowered costs. When I talk about telecom, it sounds 27,000 down to 7. The thing was that new businesses just sprung up in the telecommunication area. So you had almost 30,000 employed, but they were doing things that we hadn't done in telecommunications before.
So I will quote directly from your paper. Winning public acceptance depends crucially on demonstrating that you are improving the opportunity for people as a whole while protecting the most vulnerable groups in the community. So how did you protect the most vulnerable groups?
Well, when we made changes, for instance, we had tax changes. We took the top tax rate from 65 cents down to 33 cents. We dropped corporate taxes down from, I think, 48 cents down to 33. But in any of those changes, we made sure that the low income were better off. And more particularly, we made sure that there was protection for low income families in particular. So we thought through the process of helping those who might be disadvantaged or find the change more difficult.
Principle 3, speed is essential. It is impossible to go too fast. Speed is essential and it is impossible to go too fast. Even at maximum speed, the total program will take some years to implement. The short-term trade-off costs start from day one. Vested interests seeking to preserve past privileges will always argue strongly for a slower pace of change. It gives them more time to mobilize public opinion against the reform. In our conversation before we started, and I asked you what would you have done differently, you said you would have gone faster. Would you like to talk a little bit more?
Well, look, where we did not make the reform, and that's where ultimately I fell out with David Longy, was in the social policy area. We didn't change education. We didn't change in a fundamental way health. And these are the areas which are creating the problem for New Zealand today: welfare, education, and when I say I'd gone faster, if it had just been me in control, I would have made fundamental changes in the areas of education, health, and welfare, because those groups, you know, got into a position where they were able to protect themselves, and the result of that is our health system's not working well, our education system is not working well, etc. I tried to get Alan Gibbs, who changed forestry from a deficit of 180 million 1 year to a surplus 2 years later of 132, to move into the health area. We managed to get him to do a report, but unfortunately David Longy decided that he wasn't going to have a bar of it, and in fact replaced Michael Bassett, who was the Minister of Health and very supportive and making those changes, with someone else.
So you argue in your paper that you shouldn't be sequencing reform, that you should do the reform altogether, like a big bang. Why do you argue like that?
Because fairness in some ways. I mean, you cannot change. It's more what I said before. You can't actually take all the farmers' support and subsidies away unless you change the things which are making it difficult for farming to be productive or profitable. If you have import licensing and they have to pay too much for their inputs, then you're putting them at a disadvantage. And so if you want to be fair and you want to get support, you've got to do it across the board.
With regard to the welfare policies, I believe that your country has a socialized healthcare and socialized education system. You wanted to change the system. Let's take education. What did you want to do?
Well, probably I wanted to do more in health, but in the education, essentially, my view is that the money which we give to the education department for them to spend should go directly to the individual, and the individual chooses what school they want to send to. You could be a private, it could be a public school. It has to be approved, but after that, people should have the choice of where they send their child. At the moment, we have this crazy system in New Zealand where it's zoned. So if you live in a certain area, say you might live in Ellerslie, you have to send your child to the Ellerslie Primary School. You can't send them send your child somewhere else. And, the big thing is choice and competition. And we could have got the same sort of improvement in productivity in health and education as we managed to get in forestry, electricity, and telecom, etc.
So, when you say give the money to the people, were you going to do that through a voucher system, or how was the transfer
Yeah.
designed?
Well, I what we'd probably do is simply say to people, you have a tax credit or a voucher, whatever, worth $10,000. You can spend that at any approved school. You go there, you enroll, and the school then claims that money from the Inland Revenue Department. Now, any money that they have left over, if they've got 10,000 and only spend 5, then that 5,000 stays in the name of that child, and they can spend it in some future year, possibly university, for example.
So, this is, what you're essentially arguing is that welfare should be exposed to the rigors of a market system where there is competition and there is choice. On the face of it, uh, there is a lot of merit with this idea, but all over the world, there is resistance to do this. There are only very few places and countries that have implemented this kind of market system. What is the problem, Sir Roger?
Well, in power, it's all about power. The education teachers unions have got too much power. The politicians like the fact that they've got the power to make these decisions. Um, they're not putting the child first. And if we did that, we would go to a system along the lines I talked about. Essentially, you could reduce taxes, and so that people have got the money. But in the case of education, that sort of stands out. Health, universal, everyone. In the case of education, well, not every person has a child going to school, and if they do, it might be only for another 10 years, etc. But the power of the teachers' union in New Zealand is very, very strong, and the performance of the education system is terrible. At the moment, we about 30-40% of our children quite regularly don't go to school.
So, your fourth principle talks about once you start the momentum, never let it stop rolling. Government can develop public awareness of the key issues by structuring the content and sequence of its packages to dramatize the relevance of the fundamental economic linkages. Uh, can you further elaborate?
Well, a lot of that's got to do with what I've been talking about, the removal of privileges. And if you're going to take away one person's privileges, you need, to take any privileges that anyone else has. And the withdrawal of privileges is fundamental, in my view, to being able to make the changes that we did and that many countries require.
If I can move on to principle 5, consistency plus credibility equals economic confidence. Continuous credibility is essential to to maintain public confidence in the structural reform and minimize the costs. The key to credibility is consistency of policy and communication. When the government lacks credibility, people refuse to change until the clash between their old behavior and the new policy imperatives has imposed a large avoidable cost on the economy. So, I think you touch on the need for communication. We are also having this issue that perhaps our government is not sufficiently communicating all the changes that are being done. How did you approach communications whilst you were doing these reforms?
Oh, it was fundamental, really. You have to be upfront. uh, we could go back to Thomas Sowell, couldn't we? You, if you want to help people, you tell them the truth. And the problem with most governments around the world is they don't necessarily tell the people of the country the truth. They actually, and we've had it here, I could name prime ministers, they do polling. Having polled and found out what the public want, they then promise it to them, even if it's going to hurt them. So you've got to have courage, and you've got to be prepared to tell people the truth, and you've got to do that consistency. And if you do it long enough, you'll get credibility. And once you've got credibility, you're likely to get confidence amongst the community. The other point is that when you talk about structural change, in a way it has its own internal logic. You make one change and it becomes almost evident that you need to do something extra. And I used to operate generally when I was making these changes. I wouldn't do it from a report. I'd have the report, I'd read it, I'd get the people in, and we'd sit down and debate and argue. And I never went away from that one of those meetings without realizing that we needed to do something else as well in addition.
Did you get a lot of support from your cabinet?
Yes. There was opposition. I won't name names, but not surprising. There were some people who wanted to go slower. There's some people who sort of wanted to stop for a while, and Longy was in that category. But frankly, as I say in the paper, once you've got the ball rolling, you need to keep it rolling. Otherwise, you get to a situation where people, some of the interest groups, will start to defend their position, and that changes that should be made can't be made. You need to remember that some changes you can make just like that. Other changes might take a couple of years in the planning. For example, we moved from our indirect taxes. We had taxes on all sorts of products at different rates. And we got rid of those taxes and introduced a goods and services tax on everything. And that sounds easy, but it took 2 years work before we were actually able to implement it. So you need to take that into consideration as well when you're doing these. Some things, we got rid of import licensing, price control, rent controls. We did that in one day, one afternoon, sat down and passed the laws to get rid of them. But you couldn't do that when you talked about the goods and services tax.
Now, Sri Lanka also has recently widened. We have a VAT system, and there were a lot of exemptions in the VAT system.
We have none.
Right. You have none,
We had
yes.
none.
So there are people arguing in Sri Lanka that you should have differential rates, that you should have exemptions, etc. But you took the decision, everything flat rate of GST of 10%. What was your thinking?
Right.
Why should it be for, on everything, no exemptions?
Well, it's fair, isn't it? And it's simple. And if you don't have, so at 10%, let's assume I put it in, introduced at 10%, and we got $10 billion. As soon as if I said, I will not have it on food, let's for example, that's what happens there. You have to have it at a rate of 13 or 14% on everything else. And it's crazy because the government, say, needs 10 billion. The best way to do it is do it a flat rate, and it's simple. If I'm got to pay my GST, if it's a flat rate of 10%, all I need to do is go down my bank statement, add up all the sales I've made, and pay the government 10%. But, you know, if you have exemption, you can imagine a supermarket who is selling 100 million a month, all of a sudden don't need to pay it on apples or oranges. Well, it's just crazy. I'll give you an example. The diplomats in New Zealand came along, and they don't pay taxes, and they didn't want to pay GST. And I just told them go away, and they pay it.
So one of the things that when you have exemptions, that it distorts relative prices. So you know some goods are advantaged over other goods.
Yeah, absolutely. That's another reason. But you keep it flat and low, and why? You know, if you have politicians making decisions on a lower rate for item A, but an increased rate on item B. What you avoid all of that rubbish, and it's worked well, very well. You have the odd person who wants to make changes, but not too many.
I was reading a OECD document on consumption taxes, and I noticed that the concept, there's a metric called the VAT ratio, and New Zealand has 100%. That means that you have a, GST across everything. Do you have GST on financial services?
No, that's the one thing we couldn't work out. But they can't claim it back on certain items, their expenditure. So, you know, we just could not find, and we tried to find a way of doing it on financial services.
So Sri Lanka, I have read the literature on this. The problem I think is the input credit problem, because otherwise every depositor will have to be registered. But Sri Lanka incidentally has something called the financial VAT. So you don't pass it on, but it is imputed on the value addition, then there is a tax imposed. So what happens is that the net interest margin, etc., expands to encompass that.
Well, the banks don't pay it if you on, but they don't. They buy a lot of goods that they don't claim back necessarily their input costs. They don't get them back.
When it comes to direct taxation, income tax, you also have been a proponent that of a flat rate. Am I correct? Instead of a progressive system.
Well, Yes and no. I was wanted a flat rate, and in fact, we introduced a flat rate until I had my problems with David Longy of 23 cents. But we really had two rates. We had 0 and 23 cents. So I had a system where families, they didn't start paying the 23 cents until, say, they'd earned $25,000. So there was, in one sense, two rates, 0 and 23.
So why did you propose a flat rate, not a progressive system? Because the argument goes, the people who argue for a progressive system says the rich people should be paying more taxes, and that is the argument for progressivity.
Well, what I say, I mean, everyone should pay tax, but what the basis of having the 0 was that people, you want them to earn income in order to look after themselves. So if I'm a couple and I'm got 4 children, then for a couple and 4 children to live, they might require $25,000 or an estimate. And so they start to pay the flat rate from 23 cents. A single person can start, from $1.
So, Sir Roger, that I understand that you have a minimum threshold, but why didn't you want the richer people, the high income earners, instead of paying at 23% to say maybe pay at 40%?
Well, I think at the end of the day, they're going to pay a lot more anyway, are they not? And and it's an incentive for them to earn more. I should tell you, maybe I can say this. Trevor DeClean, who was my associate minister, he was not in the cabinet, but he was Minister of Revenue, and he was the person who put all my tax legislation through select committee. And I went with him one day or one evening. I had a new business had been opened, and I'd opened it. But in the evening, Trevor DeClean was the after dinner speaker. They had an evening where they had food and wine, etc., and he was the after dinner speaker. And he's quite a character, Trevor. And this, we had reduced at that point taxes down from 65 down, I think, to maybe 48, and then later on we did to 33. And he said, "We've lowered taxes, we've done that." And he said, "The money's just flooding in. And the third floor, it's pouring in." And that was true. Even though we'd lowered the tax from 66 to 33, we got more money in the door. And then he said, the only problem is we send it down from the 6th floor to the 5th floor, and they flush some of it down the toilet. The character.
So when you reduced the rate, you also removed many of the deductions, right?
I can't think of any. We may well have done if there were what I would call privilege deduction, they would have gone, but I can't actually think of any.
If I can move on, the sixth principle, let the dog see the rabbit. Let the dog see the rabbit. People cannot cooperate with the reform process unless they know where you are heading. Go as fast as you can, but where predictable, give them notice by spelling out your objectives and intentions in advance. Where programs can or will be implemented in stages over time, publish the timetable upfront. Um, would you like to elaborate?
Well, it really is important. If you want people to cooperate, the more notice you can give them of the changes, the better. For example, an example of that would be when we reduced tariffs. So we published a 4-year program. It said the tariff is, say, 100. It's getting in the end of the first year, it's going to go down to 70. The end of the second year, it's going to go to 50. End of the third year, it's going to go to 25. And the fourth year, it's going to go to 10% or whatever, or zero. And so that gave people time to adjust. It gave people the capacity to think about whether they wanted to stay in the business they were in. Take a manufacturer would then make a calculation, might say, I've got 60% protection now, in 4 years' time, I'm only going to have 20. So they might decide to become an importer rather than a manufacturer, or they say, I can make changes and I can still be in business. In fact, I can become an exporter or whatever.
But when you give time, say you upfront indicate how you're going to do it, don't you give space for vested interests to organize and rally and try to stop the process?
Or they tried that for a while, but they gave up. We used to have people in Wellington who were there lobbying on behalf of, say, the car importers or someone else, but they gave up. And in the end, that most of them felt it was fair, so long as you're even-handed. You've got to remember that whilst some of these changes might have adversely impacted a particular industry, that same industry benefited from the changes that were made in other areas. So they had a vested interest. Once the change, you've lost your privilege. You actually become an advocate for everyone else to lose their privilege, because that's the only you win. You're a winner.
So what is the trade regime like now in New Zealand? You don't have import tariffs on many items. Is it completely taken away?
Oh no, we still have tariffs. I don't know that. Look, I'm not really up to date. I don't think tariffs have been reduced dramatically over the last few years, except when we've gone into free trade groups, which New Zealand supports very strongly.
Your seventh principle is never fall into the trap of selling the public short. Do not mistake fears of the politicians for ignorance, lack of guts, or lack of realism on the part of the voting public. Very profound words. Why do you say that?
Well, you need to tell the public, if you're going to get the public cooperation, you need to take them into your confidence. You need to tell the public what the problem is and how it arose. You need to tell the public what damage it is doing to their own particular interests. You need to tell the public what your objectives are in making the change and how you intend to achieve those objectives. You need also to tell them what the costs and the benefits of the action will be and why your approach is better than what exists at the present time. So, taking the public make lots of decisions, difficult decisions within the family unit, and generally, if you're open and honest with them and tell them the truth, they'll go along.
Your eighth principle, don't blink. Public confidence rests on your composure. Structural reform in New Zealand involved ministers in making some of the most radical decisions announced to the public for 50 years or so. Relaxed, matter of fact composure is essential every time you face the public. Their confidence is always based on yours. So it was like when I first did Toastmasters, they said importance of being earnest. So I think that is the essence of your argument here, that you should believe what you're saying.
Oh, absolutely. Well, if you don't, why would anyone else? And you've got to present it. And if people start to come back at you, you can't afford to blink. I can't actually think about when we change, but when with representations, maybe small changes when it went in the tax area when we took the legislation through. But the truth is, if you blink, then why should the public have any confidence in your program at all?
So, Sir Roger, if I can probe this a little bit about your own personal convictions. You were a revolutionary reformer in a time when this was not in vogue. Were there specific things in your life or your surroundings that made you like this?
No, not really. I think I learned a lot. I went into politics in 1969. I became finance minister in 1984. I think I learned a lot during that period and became more familiar with some of the economics of choice and competition, etc. And I wasn't tribal in the sense that a lot of people are, both in the Conservative Party and in the Labor Party. They're tribal, and it's sort of right or wrong. I'm going to support a particular viewpoint.
So, Sir Roger, you also argue about what a traditional Labour Party was. You in your opening you said the Labour Party represented the interests of unions, but in your paper you really say that the Labour ordinary people and what matters to them are they are also consumers. So they should, as consumers, get a fair deal.
Oh, absolutely. The Labor Party was formed at in 18 whatever, and it was formed out of the trade union. It had changed even in 1969. It did represent working people, and the trade union was still active within the Labor Party, but there were a lot of other views as well.
I don't know whether you are familiar with the work of the McKinsey Global Institute, but they brought out a seminal piece called The Power of Productivity. And one of the key messages that they gave is governments should put the interests of consumers first. Why is it that governments put the interests of producers first?
Well, I actually formed, when I left the Labor Party, um, ACT New Zealand, which was the Association of Consumers and Taxpayers. So we saw the role looking after the interests of the taxpayer and the consumers and taxpayers. And in the end of the day, um, I think that's basically uh, what political parties should be about. They're not about representing one particular interest group. You look after consumers, which is everyone, but you also need to have pay a lot of attention to the taxpayer, the people who are paying, to make sure that, to the extent the government's involved, there's fairness in who pays in. And of course, I would argue that VAT, or our goods and services tax, which is flat rate across the board, is a fair tax. And I would also advocate understanding what any family or individual needs in order to live reasonably comfortably, and they pay tax beyond that level. So I'm quite keen on a zero rate up to a level where the person can look after themselves and they pay into the government on the money they earn beyond that, which means that the higher income are going to pay by far and away the most.
When Australia did a lot of reform, they set up a productivity commission. Does New Zealand have a productivity commission, and was that set up when you were in office?
They did, we did, but we've just got rid of it. The main reason we got rid of it, we had, well, I better be careful. The person who was the head of it was supposed to be an economist, but I found I probably agreed with him once out of 100. And the new government have decided they just got rid of it. I'm not sure that was the right reaction, but I think they wound it up rather than just move the chairman.
So the ninth principle is incentives, choice, monopoly. Get the fundamentals right. A sick economy cannot be regulated back into health. Economic dynamism is the liberated energy of people at every level, personally choosing and using opportunities that benefit them. Government's role is to create a framework that widens their opportunities for choice, improves the incentives to productive activity, and sees that their gain benefits society as a whole. So this is a very like a social market economic thinking, that you leave it to the market economy.
Absolutely, people there needs to be competition. There needs to be choice. We need to understand that incentives matter. We need to understand that there's no free lunch. We need to understand that voluntary exchange is what promotes economic progress. All of those things are important. We need to understand too, I think, what are the major sources of economic progress. I'd put in there, obviously, there's things like low tax rate, free trade, monetary stability, and having an efficient capital market, competitive markets, absolutely. Freedom of exchange, and private ownership. All those things are fundamental to a prosperous economy. Governments are there to do those things that the private sector can't, like defence and looking after prisons, things of that nature. After that, unless government can do it as efficiently as the private sector, they shouldn't get involved. In terms of health, there are obviously areas of health where the private sector wouldn't do it because they couldn't earn any revenue by doing it. But we need to fundamentally think about what drives productivity, what drives investment, and get on with it.
You know, your beliefs, I think, fundamentally are that people should be self-reliant. Um, incidentally, Singapore. I said, incidentally, Singapore.
Well, Singapore model is close to where I would be.
Singapore had a social compact in its early days where its government was pushing its population to be self-reliant. Did you, by any chance, ever get an opportunity to interact with Lee Kuan Yew?
I did on one occasion. I mean, he's a remarkable man, and Singapore. Today's Singaporeans, I'm sure, would, think highly of him. They have to. And he had courage too, and he was prepared to tell people the truth. There was a story that I heard. It was in the health area related to medication, and they were free. And he changed that and started to charge for medication. And the reason was, he said, if I went to go to someone's home and I opened the cupboard in the bathroom, there's all this medication people haven't taken that has been prescribed for them. He said, if people pay for it, they take it. You give it to them free, they don't necessarily. So he was prepared to tackle some of the tough issues as well. He's a great man.
Did you interact with any other world leaders who impressed you, who fundamentally transformed their countries?
Oh, I think, I don't know of anyone else who changed it in the way Lee Kuan Yew did. Well, I mean, New Zealand's standard of living in 1960 was at least double what Singapore. Today, their standard of living is at least double what New Zealand is. And the difference between the two is they've made fundamental changes. The ACT Party, which I formed in 1993 with Derek Quigley, who was a member of the National Party, so we'd been on opposite sides of the fence in Parliament, that was basically based around pensions, healthcare, getting housing, people being able to do all of those things for themselves. And we created the position. In other words, savings, not taxation. Now that party, unfortunately, got into the hands, policy-wise, of the Libertarian. libertarian group who basically didn't believe in welfare at all, and said if you don't have welfare, well, there'll be charities that will look after people. After 100 years, I'm not sure about that. So ACT moved off the policies that we had of superannuation for everyone, healthcare for everyone, and some other change, education, being able to go wherever they like, but they didn't replace it. They just went to where the Conservative and Labor Party were more government.
So, your 10th principle, when in doubt, ask yourself, why am I in politics? I think you spoke a little bit about this at the beginning of our conversation. Can you further elaborate?
Well, I think it is an important point. Why are you there? Are you there because for your own ego? Are you there for the power? Or are you there really to help people? And if you're there to help people, then be honest and upfront with them, and follow policies that or quality policies that will work. And it also involves a bit of courage, having some vision, having some imagination, but also courage. If you lose, so be it. But be honest and determined to do what you know to be the right thing. And quite often, politicians know what the right thing. The problem is they don't do it because they'll lose power and they like the power.
So, Sir Roger, Sri Lanka is going through an enormous economic crisis. It's a once in a generational crisis. Our economy has contracted almost 15%. We had 70% inflation, and we are in a critical juncture in our history, post-independence history, that we can make the type of changes that you made in New Zealand that put it on a different path. What is your advice to us?
Elect politicians who will do the job they're elected for. People, you need people who, in a way, have other options and don't need politics. You need to elect people who essentially know what needs to be done and are brave enough to do it. I think if you can design it in a way where the most vulnerable people are protected, largely protected, you're going to have an easier ride through. But, I don't know enough about the circumstances to be specific, but it won't get any easier. And you do need to do it with speed and determination. I mean, we got elected and in August '84, and before we had actually sworn in, we had made a decision that we're going to get rid of rent controls, interest rate controls, price controls. We were going to devalue by 20%, and a whole lot of other decisions. And we did that day we won. And I would imagine there are a whole list of things which Sri Lanka could do, which would help, not just over the long term, but also in some ways on the short term. Because one of the things that helped us, once we started to make those sort of changes. We got an awful lot of support from people, businesses and foreign individuals who were prepared to invest in New Zealand and did. And if they see that the government is determined and is consistent and doesn't back down every time someone throws a brick at them, you'll find there's a lot of people offshore who would come and support. I'm sure of it.
You are a senior person, and when you look back at your life, what is your legacy? What would you like to be remembered for?
I haven't really thought about it, but I'm not very good at dwelling on things like that. I think there'll be a mix. I mean, there are still people who think I'm the devil. There are other people in New Zealand who think I saved New Zealand. I'm not sure what that mix is. But I think history will be maybe kinder to me than some people were in the 1980s. Because I think maybe I should, my legacy in a way is the changes I made are basically still in place. And that is proof, I think, or evidence that we did the right thing. And, not many governments can say that 40 years later, the legislation they put in place is still in place. It might have changed slightly, but the lower taxes, the lower tariffs, all those things have remained in place in New Zealand.
Sir Roger Douglas, this has been a fascinating conversation. Thank you very much for joining Advocata today. You are indeed a unique person, and I wish you the best of health and happiness.
Thank you.